The polar bear shed tears when she couldn't rescue her cub. Then an explorer saw the bear, and he accidentally put himself in danger again. The landscape of Svalbard spread before Nolan like a vast, frozen canvas, each shade of white and blue tinted with the soft blush of dawn. Sharp peaks jutted into the sky, their tips brushing against a veil of mist, while glaciers wound their way through valleys like immense rivers, halted by time. This place, wild, raw, and isolated, held a beauty Nolan hadn't fully anticipated. Today was his last day on the islands, and though he'd shared countless adventures with his friends over the past week, there was one experience that had eluded him. A glimpse of a polar bear in its natural habitat. He couldn't shake the feeling that leaving without this encounter would make his journey incomplete. He'd heard enough stories to understand the risk. Locals had warned his group to keep their distance should they be fortunate or unfortunate enough to spot one. Yet, despite the cautionary tales, Nolan felt a pull, a quiet yearning for a sighting. There was something about the idea of seeing a creature so adapted to this hostile land that fascinated him, as if it might reveal some truth about the place itself. The sun had barely risen, but the allure of the early morning silence drew him from the warmth of his bed. His friends were still asleep, their breathing slow and steady against the gentle hum of the lodge's heater. Nolan dressed quietly, pulling on his layers, boots and gloves. He left a quick note, went for a quick ski back soon, and slipped out into the crisp air. The crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness. The vast whiteness stretched endlessly, and as he skied through the snowfields, Nolan found himself sinking into the quiet rhythm of it. He pushed forward, taking in the stark, open landscape. Frost clung to his eyelashes, and his breath came in small clouds that hung in the air. Soon, he approached the glacier they'd passed the day before, a towering formation of blue ice that split the land like a scar, the light catching in its crevices and casting eerie, fractured reflections. He slowed to a stop, propping himself up on his poles, and took in the sight. The glacier loomed like a frozen fortress, formidable and indifferent. Nolan raised his camera, framing the scene, when suddenly the stillness was interrupted by a sound, faint, barely audible at first, carried on the light breeze. A weak, plaintive cry. He froze, his senses straining to make sense of the sound. It rose again, a thin wail that seemed out of place amidst the frozen silence. Nolan lowered his camera, his attention fixed on the distant echo, trying to discern what he was hearing. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard before, part whimper, part call. It held a haunting, lonely quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, he moved slowly in the direction of the sound, his skis sliding over the hard-packed snow. He scanned the landscape, but nothing stirred. The wind howled across the barren Arctic expanse, each gust laced with icy particles that clung to Nolan's face. He trudged forward, his boots sinking into snow that seemed to have no end, guided only by the faint, distressed cries echoing through the wilderness. As he drew closer, the sounds grew sharper, piercing through the wind like a desperate plea. There, half buried in the thick snow, was a bear cub, shivering and weak, its small body fighting against the relentless blizzard. The cub's eyes, wide and filled with panic, darted back and forth as it struggled to stay upright. It had been separated, helpless and alone from its mother, its instincts guiding it to survive in the only way it knew. For a moment, Nolan's heart tightened, knowing the risk that lay ahead. A cub this young was never far from its mother, and white bears were known to defend their young with ferocity. But he couldn't just leave it here to die. He took a step closer, gauging the space between him and the tiny creature, and whispered to himself, "Easy now. We're going to figure this out." As he closed the gap, Nolan scanned the area, bracing himself for any sign of the mother bear. His gaze fell upon a lump in the snow, a mere shadow against the pale landscape, and his heart sank. The mother bear lay sprawled out, her massive body twisted awkwardly, one powerful paw caught in a net, a poacher's snare. The cruel rope was anchored to the ice, pulled taut, rendering her immobile. Her eyes, bloodshot and wide with fear, flashed as she jerked against the net, each movement more frantic than the last as she tried to reach her cub. The fury in her gaze was mixed with despair, a mother's helplessness as she watched her child struggle within arm's reach, yet beyond her ability to protect. Nolan steadied his breathing, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He knew the risk of approaching them both, but realized there was little choice now. "Hang tight," he murmured, his voice low, meant as much for himself as for the animals. He took a cautious step toward the cub, maintaining his distance from the mother, who let out a strained, guttural sound. The noise was both warning and plea, a stark reminder of her fierce drive to protect, even when defenseless. Carefully, Nolan moved closer to the cub, lowering himself to appear less threatening. "Hey there, little one," he murmured softly. His tone was steady, calm, in stark contrast to the storm swirling around them. The cub froze, locking eyes with him, its tiny body quivering. It could have bolted, but there was a helplessness in the way it sank back down, accepting Nolan's presence as something different from the storm, from the bitter cold. Slowly, he reached into his coat, pulling out his scarf. He wrapped it around the cub, feeling its thin, cold body nestled against the fabric. The cub's eyes shifted, less wild now, watching him with a mix of trust and uncertainty. He held it close to his chest, hoping his body warmth would offer it some comfort. Just as he adjusted the scarf around the cub, a low, growling rumble pulled him back into awareness of the mother. The bear's eyes narrowed as she saw Nolan holding her cub, her protective instincts fighting against the trap that held her down. She struggled against the snare, teeth bared, claws raking against the ice, sending sprays of snow in all directions. For a split second, he felt the weight of her rage. But then, as she saw the care in his movements, the way he cradled the cub, the way he tucked it close to shield it from the storm, her agitation shifted, her growls softened, and a quiet, almost pained resignation filled her gaze. Nolan held his ground, meeting her eyes, and she stared back, no longer in anger, but as if sizing up this human who had dared to intervene. The ferocity in her gaze faded, replaced by a weary understanding. In that instant, she seemed to accept him, realizing he wasn't there to harm, but to help. The Arctic wind stung Nolan's face as he turned his gaze back toward the mother bear, still thrashing against the unyielding snare. Her movements were frantic, her muscles taut under her thick white fur, each twist of her trapped paw met with a strain that shook her whole body. Her eyes, normally fierce and unyielding, were now wide with terror, darting to where her cub was cradled in Nolan's arms. The need to reach her young was clear, but the net cut harshly into her paw, biting deeper each time she pulled. Nolan felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to hesitation, but standing there, clutching the trembling cub in his jacket, he realized just how precarious the situation had become. He'd seen that look in animals before, the desperate, almost human resignation that comes when hope begins to fade. It was a sight that unsettled him deeply. Just as he took a step forward, he noticed the ice beneath her. A subtle spider web of cracks was forming under her weight, each one spreading outwards in fragile, splintered lines. If the ice gave way, she'd plunge into the freezing water below, unable to swim with her paw trapped. Nolan knew the chances of her surviving that fall were next to none. He let out a sharp breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His instincts told him that saving her was not just dangerous, but verging on impossible. Bears were unpredictable, and an injured mother bear, one desperate to protect her young, was even more so. She could easily turn on him, attacking before he had a chance to free her. And in the middle of this icy landscape, there was no room for mistakes. Nolan set the cub down gently, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Stay here, little one," he murmured. The cub looked up, its eyes full of innocence, unaware of the turmoil unfolding around it. Nolan's gloved hand brushed the small head once, a brief gesture of reassurance. He took a step forward, and then another, every movement measured and slow. "Easy," he whispered under his breath, his voice barely carrying above the wind. The mother bear's eyes locked onto him, her growls deepening as if she sensed he was nearing. Her breath came in harsh, misty clouds against the bitter cold. And for a moment, Nolan thought she'd try to lunge, to break free despite the net digging deeper into her paw. But then she stilled, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of recognition. She seemed to remember the way he'd held her cub, the gentle movements of his hands, and her growls softened into tense breaths. It was a tenuous understanding, and Nolan knew it wouldn't hold for long. He knelt down, assessing the net. It was crude, but tight, secured with loops of wire, twisted so fiercely they'd begun to cut into her fur. His fingers moved to his pocket, pulling out a folding knife. He paused, glancing up at her, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no trust, but there was something else. A silent acknowledgement of the moment, the sheer desperation of it all. The knife blade glinted as he slid it carefully under the first loop, his fingers numb from the cold, but steady. Each cut was slow, methodical, with the mother bear's movements mirroring his tension. The ice beneath them let out a soft groan, a reminder of the fragile balance they teetered on. Nolan's heart raced as he felt the cracks tremor under his knees, but he pushed the thought aside, focused only on freeing her. Nolan's hands worked quickly, fingers numb as he struggled with the frayed edge of the net cutting into the mother bear's paw. She watched him, her wary eyes filled with something like trust, an uneasy truce in this frozen wilderness. Just as he began to make headway, the distant crunch of footsteps on snow, followed by low voices and muffled laughter, broke through the cold silence. Nolan froze, heart pounding. The voices had the flat, clipped rhythm of Norwegian, punctuated by the guttural laughs of men who knew they held power out here, where the laws of the land felt thin as ice. Poachers. They were close, likely checking their traps. Nolan's mind raced. He glanced around, desperately searching for a place to hide the cub. Not far from where they stood, half submerged in the frozen surface of the river, lay the wreck of a small boat, wedged in ice and forgotten by time. It jutted out from the ground like a ghostly monument, its jagged edges promising enough cover to conceal him and the cub, at least for a moment. Moving quickly, he scooped the cub into his arms, holding it tight against his chest, feeling the weight and warmth of the small body. The cub wriggled weakly, letting out a soft whimper, and he murmured low, calming words as he crossed the snow to the boat. Once there, he crouched behind it, pressing his back to the cold wood and peering out cautiously. The poachers emerged from behind a ridge, their figures silhouetted against the icy horizon. There were 2 of them, each carrying rifles slung over their shoulders and packs bulging with equipment. Their faces lit up with excitement as they spotted the mother bear, trapped and thrashing in the snow, a prize worth more than just the pelt of a cub. One of them, a burly man with a thick woolen cap pulled low, grinned and jabbed his partner in the ribs. "Look at her. Big one, too," he said, voice muffled but the satisfaction unmistakable. The other man approached the bear cautiously, pulling out a knife to check the tension on the net. His hands were steady, practiced, betraying his ease with cruelty. Nolan felt a surge of anger rise, but he forced himself to stay focused. He needed a plan, a way to draw their attention elsewhere before they realized he was here and before they thought to look for the cub. With one last look at the cub, Nolan set it down in a shallow groove in the ice, whispering, "Stay here, buddy." Then, steeling himself, he stood, straightened his coat, and took a deep breath before stepping out from behind the boat. He adopted a friendly, somewhat confused smile and began speaking loudly in German, raising a hand as if greeting them. "Entschuldigen Sie, ich glaube, ich habe mich verlaufen," he called out, his tone bright and friendly, like an unsuspecting tourist. The two men froze, their hands hovering near their weapons as they turned toward him, suspicion clear on their faces. They shared a quick glance, and Nolan could tell they didn't understand a word he'd said. One of them took a wary step forward, but Nolan kept talking, holding his hands up to show he was harmless, his voice filled with casual enthusiasm. "I saw a cub trapped over there by the other side of the ice bridge," he continued in German, pointing in a direction opposite from where the cub was actually hidden. His eyes widened with feigned excitement as he gestured energetically, putting on the full show of a clueless traveler, lost but eager. They exchanged glances again, unsure of his meaning, but Nolan saw the moment the words "cub" and "trapped" registered with them. They began talking rapidly to each other in Norwegian, one of them squinting at Nolan with clear doubt. Nolan kept his friendly grin plastered on, waving again to emphasize his harmlessness, adding a few more phrases in German for good measure. Finally, the larger poacher rolled his eyes, muttering something Nolan couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. He wanted Nolan to move along, to disappear before he could cause trouble. They muttered between themselves, weighing the risk of leaving the mother bear unattended against the possibility of an easy capture of the cub. Nolan sensed them wavering, so he gestured one last time toward the direction he'd pointed out, then turned as if to head off, looking back at them expectantly. With a dismissive wave, the poachers shouted at him to go. "Get lost now," one barked in heavily accented English. Nolan put on a show of nodding eagerly, feigning relief at their approval, and then began walking briskly away, hoping his steps looked light and carefree. From the corner of his eye, he watched them head off toward the spot he'd pointed out, leaving the mother bear bound but temporarily safe. Nolan's heartbeat slowed as he circled back, slipping behind the boat where he'd left the cub. He gathered the small bear back into his arms, murmuring reassurances, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on his mind. He knew the danger wasn't over, but he had bought them time. For now, that would have to be enough. The silence of the Arctic night hung heavy as Nolan worked quickly, his breath forming thick clouds in the icy air. Using a makeshift metal hook he'd salvaged from an abandoned boat nearby, he wedged it between the tightly knotted strands of the trap that had bound the mother bear. His gloved fingers trembled from cold and concentration, but he kept a firm grip, twisting and pulling with quiet desperation. He had to hurry. The poachers weren't far, and the bear cub, hidden nearby in the snow, would only wait for so long before it cried out for its mother. The crunch of footsteps on snow shattered the calm. Nolan turned sharply, his heart sinking as he saw the figures of the poachers returning, moving through the thick snow with grim determination. In the faint moonlight, their faces were harsh, their expressions twisted with suspicion as they took in the abandoned snare and the empty space where their prize had been. One of them cursed under his breath, the words lost in the frigid wind, but the meaning clear. Before Nolan could react, one of the men advanced toward him, grabbing him by the front of his coat and yanking him forward. "What do you think you're doing out here?" The poacher spat, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nolan with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I was just—" Nolan began, but he cut himself off, steadying himself. He met the poacher's gaze head-on, refusing to look away. "You realize this is kidnapping, right? A foreigner goes missing, people notice. You're putting a spotlight on yourselves." The poachers exchanged glances, but their expressions remained hardened. The one holding Nolan tightened his grip, his jaw set in a harsh line. "What spotlight? Nobody's coming all the way out here for some lost hiker," he sneered. "You're just one of many who won't make it out of this wasteland." Nolan forced himself to stay calm, his mind racing. He knew he was in a dire situation, yet he held on to his composure. "Listen," he said, his voice steady. "You might not realize it, but I have people expecting me back. If I disappear, it won't be long before they're out here searching. And you think they won't notice a poacher's trail?" The other poacher, a lanky man with a rough voice, laughed mockingly. "You're a bold one, aren't you? Think you're going to talk your way out of this?" He grabbed Nolan's arm, his grip digging into the thick fabric of his coat as he and his partner exchanged smirks. "You're not scaring anyone here." Nolan felt the weight of their contempt, but he kept his head high. He took a slow breath. "You have no idea the kind of trouble you're inviting," he warned, his voice low but firm. "A missing persons case brings authorities. This isn't just another hunt you can brush under the snow." The words barely seemed to reach them. With a scoff, the first poacher shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "Enough," he muttered. In a swift, practiced movement, they twisted Nolan's arms behind his back, binding his wrists tightly with a frayed length of rope. "You've talked enough, hero," the poacher growled, yanking the knot taut. "You're coming with us." As they dragged him through the snow, the cold seeping into his bones, Nolan glanced back one last time in the direction where the bear had disappeared. He felt a flicker of hope, a spark that maybe, somehow, his efforts had meant something. Yet, as the men pulled him further away, reality crashed down on him like the icy wind cutting through his skin. Alone, outnumbered and bound, Nolan was left with little but a sinking feeling of finality. They moved deeper into the Arctic's endless whiteness, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The poachers grunted orders at each other, their voices low and coarse, but Nolan barely registered them. He focused on the vastness around him, on the relentless cold, feeling its bite as though it were the very grip of fate tightening around him. His breaths came in shallow puffs, his mind racing, grasping for anything, any faint hope, any sign. Yet in that unforgiving expanse, there was nothing but the cold, the snow, and the harsh truth of his situation. As they forced him forward, Nolan whispered a quiet, desperate prayer, his voice lost to the wind. In that moment, he knew he was at the mercy of something far greater than himself, and he could only hope that the Arctic, as fierce and untamed as it was, had one last mercy left to offer. The cold pressed down like a weight, filling every hollow in the snow-laden clearing. Nolan lay on the frozen ground, his hands bound, struggling to keep his breath steady against the harsh bite of the Arctic wind. Around him, the poachers huddled close, murmuring among themselves. Their rough faces flickered in and out of sight under the weak, filtered light as they pulled scarves and hoods tighter, oblivious to the barren expanse stretching out before them. One of the men knelt, checking the rope around Nolan's wrists, his grin sharp with contempt. "Thought you'd be smart, did you?" he sneered, his voice barely rising above a whisper, almost lost in the muffled roar of the approaching blizzard. Nolan felt his jaw tighten, but said nothing. The odds were against him here. Words wouldn't change his fate. As the poachers settled in, preparing to take him deeper into the desolate cold, a sudden piercing crack shattered the silence. It echoed across the landscape, louder than any howl of the wind, a sound like thunder rolling over the snow. The men jolted upright, their attention snapping toward the dark horizon. Out of the swirling snow, a shadow began to materialize, large, unmistakable, moving with a slow, steady determination. The mother bear. The poachers fell silent, their expressions shifting from annoyance to fear. Nolan's heart pounded as he watched her approach, her eyes fixed on the group with a focus that left no room for doubt. She recognized him, even from a distance, the man who had freed her cub from the jaws of the storm. Her massive form moved closer, her pale fur a stark contrast against the shadowed snow, each step exuding an unwavering purpose. One of the poachers cursed under his breath, his hands tightening on his rifle. Another shot him a panicked glance, whispering, "This isn't worth it." The bear's growl rose, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground as she advanced, her powerful body coiled like a spring. They knew, as did Nolan, that it would be madness to confront a polar bear, enraged and undeterred. The leader looked back at Nolan as though debating his next move, but his grip on the rope had slackened, and Nolan saw his chance. Working quickly, he managed to wriggle his wrists free, moving just enough to regain some control over his arms. Meanwhile, the mother bear had reached the edge of the clearing, her pace quickening, her gaze unyielding. Her growl deepened, sending an unmistakable message of warning. The poachers stumbled back, gripping their weapons but hesitating to lift them. The risk was too great, and she knew it. Just then, with a forceful swing of her massive paw, she lunged toward one of the men. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, his face drained of color. The sight was enough. Fear overtook them. They muttered to each other, frantic, and in an instant they turned, stumbling and slipping, disappearing into the white haze, leaving Nolan and the bear alone in the silence of the snow. Nolan exhaled, feeling the pressure in his chest begin to ease. Slowly, he shifted to his knees, catching his breath as he took in the bear's looming figure just feet away. She watched him now, her eyes calm, studying him as if evaluating whether her act of mercy was worth the risk she had taken. He stood, holding her gaze, his voice steady, though soft. "Thank you," he said, his words barely a whisper against the wind. She remained silent, unblinking, but something about her stance softened. Her eyes drifted to her hind leg, where a remnant of the tangled net still clung to her fur. Nolan took a slow step forward, his movements careful and deliberate, waiting for her response. She didn't move, only continued to watch as he crouched beside her, reaching toward the remaining snare. His fingers, raw from the cold, worked to untangle the webbing, his touch gentle, respectful of her strength and power. With a final tug, the net came loose, and he took a step back, giving her space. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the quiet between them filled with the shared understanding of survival. The storm raged around them, the snow swirling in a chaotic dance, but within that fragile stillness, there was peace, a mutual respect that transcended the divide between man and beast. She let out a soft exhale, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned, her form blending seamlessly into the shadows of the snow. Nolan watched as she padded away, her steps sure, her head high. A part of him wanted to follow, to ensure she and her cub would be safe. But he knew this was her world. He was merely a guy returning to the village later. Nolan couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. Every detail, every tense second replayed in his thoughts like a story he was unwilling to let go. His time in the Arctic had taught him many things, but nothing as profound as what he had witnessed with the bear and her cub. After gathering his resolve, he met with the local authorities, recounting his experience. He spoke of the poachers' traps, the suffering of the animals, and the fragile balance he had witnessed. The story caught the ear of the regional wildlife manager, a man who listened to Nolan with genuine interest. As Nolan described the mother bear's fierce resilience and the quiet moments of understanding between man and beast, the manager's expression softened, clearly moved by the story's gravity. This could mean something, the manager murmured, folding his hands as he leaned back thoughtfully. Essest, one she had chosen, however briefly, to let into her life. Slowly, almost deliberately, the mother bear lifted her paw, as though in a silent farewell. Nolan raised his hand in response, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He knew she couldn't understand gestures the way humans did, but the action felt right, a small gesture of respect and acknowledgement for all they had been through together. He watched as she turned, her body a powerful shadow against the endless expanse of white, and lumbered away into the stormy Arctic beyond, the cub following close by her side. As their figures grew smaller, blending into the landscape, Nolan felt a strange mix of relief and awe. He had witnessed the raw power of a mother's instinct, the depth of the bond between mother and cub, a force as natural and fierce as the Arctic wind. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his chest loosening with a newfound appreciation for the resilience of the wild. We're in desperate need of ways to reach people, to make them understand what's at stake here. He paused, looking Nolan in the eye. How would you feel about working with us to share this story? We could use someone with your experience to help raise awareness, to inspire others to care. Nolan considered the offer, feeling a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. I'd be honored, he replied simply, his voice steady. If telling my story can help protect what's left of these wild spaces, well, that's worth it. The next few days were filled with meetings and planning sessions, as Nolan worked with the local team to craft his story into something that could reach others, locals, tourists, and perhaps even a wider audience. Together, they began shaping a campaign to emphasize not only the need for conservation, but also the fragile beauty of the Arctic, the lives that thrived there, and the threat posed by those who would exploit it. With each retelling, Nolan felt a piece of his experience cement itself in his memory, the images of the mother bear and her cub as clear as they had been on that frozen expanse. Finally, as his time in Svalbard came to an end, Nolan found himself aboard a small plane heading back toward the mainland. The hum of the engine filled his ears as he looked out the window, watching the vast, unending stretch of ice and snow disappear below him. Part of him ached to stay, to continue what he had started. But he knew that his journey didn't end here. The memory of the mother bear's silent farewell echoed in his mind, and he knew he would return to this place. As the plane rose higher, he made a silent promise to himself. This land, these creatures, deserved his respect and his protection. And one day he would return, not as a stranger, but as a guardian, determined to safeguard the raw beauty and delicate balance of the Arctic, where nature thrived in its purest, most powerful form. A quiet sense of hope filling him. He had witnessed something extraordinary, and as he closed his eyes, he knew that his story was only just beginning. Thank you all for joining me on this journey through the icy wilderness. where we witnessed the powerful bond between a mother bear and her cub, and the courage of one man standing up to protect the untamed beauty of nature. This story is a reminder of the quiet connections we share with the wild world around us and the incredible impact each of us can make. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you think about our role in protecting nature, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your own encounters with wildlife, or any experiences that changed your view of the natural world. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire each other to cherish and protect these incredible spaces. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that brings us closer to the wonders of our world. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, we're all part of this big, beautiful planet together. See you soon.